Welcome back to another episode of Astrophotography Japan. When I started this hobby about 3 years ago, I first purchased a cheap guidescope under the Angel Eyes brand on AliExpress. And this is it. The optics are garbage. With a camera, all I can see are some crosshatched star shapes due to some lens aberration. It is probably a single lens telescope unit. So I spent a little more money and I bought the Uniguide 32 from William Optics. This scope has essentially been the workhorse for all of my guided imaging since. I have used it on my Zerboni SV503 80ED telescope and AM5 mount in every imaging session for perhaps the last 2 years. It simply works great. But recently, due to circumstances, I decided that I needed a second guidescope. I considered just buying another Uniguider, but where's the fun in that? And I have always been intrigued by the Sharpstar Askar equipment product line, especially since I bought the Askar FMA135 astrograph about 2 years ago. But more about that later. So when I recently viewed an advertisement regarding the new Askar 32mm f4 guidescope, I was intrigued. I purchased it. But let me tell you about that decision and my opinions now that I have used and methodically compared it to the William Optics Uniguider. I have to say that both the William Optics and Askar brands have excellent reputations in the field of astronomy and astrophotography, so I felt confident they would both perform well for their intended purposes. But I wanted to collect some precise data to compare and contrast the results to see if there was a performance advantage of one over the other. In this study, I used my AM5 mount for EQ tracking and ASIAIR for control, and 3 different ZWO cameras. I also took photos on 3 different star targets. The first target star I picked for imaging was Vindemiatrix in the constellation of Virgo. So I selected the William Optics Uniguide scope to go first and attached my ASI 533 MC color camera. As you may know, this is not a typical guide camera, but rather a planetary camera with a high-value 1-inch diagonal sensor. I wanted to check the doublet optics performance of the scopes with a slightly larger sensor to look for edge aberrations. As you can see here with the William Optics Uniguide scope, the quality of the star images rapidly deteriorate the further you get away from the center point on this 60-second single exposure with the 533 MC camera. The Askar guidescope is very similar, with star elongation and some slight chromatic aberration occurring at similar distances away from the center. Here are the 2 images side by side, using the same camera and settings. The images look very similar, with perhaps a little more contrast or dark background apparent on the Askar scope image, but that is debatable. Now you might say, well, of course, these scopes are only 32mm in aperture. It is not possible to get clear images all the way out to the edges of the IMX533 sensor. But you would be wrong if you thought that. Because here's a picture of the same star region using the Askar FMA135, which is a triplet design astrograph lens for astrophotography. The aperture is even 2mm less, and you can see the star shapes are well controlled all the way out to the edges of this photograph. And the stars are definitely much smaller and better defined than either of the 2 guidescopes. Here are all 3 of the images again with the astrograph lens in the center. I think overall, there are no surprises here. By the way, here are some images I previously took with the Askar FMA135 astrograph scope and the ASI 533 MC Pro color camera. I have published and talked about some of these previously in other videos. But I want to again reiterate that this lens and camera combination are an amazing match for wide-field imaging of many large deep sky objects, some of which are shown here. I really like this pairing, and it is a wonderful small footprint travel scope combination. The images cover approximately 4.5 degrees of sky across each edge of the square field of view. I mentioned earlier that besides the 533 MC camera, I tried a couple of other cameras and targets as well. In the next series of photographs, the cameras that I used are more suitable for applications and guiding due to their smaller sensor size, which pairs better with these short focal length guide scopes. The relative sensor sizes are shown here. In the next series of photos, I used the ASI 120mm guide camera. This is a monochrome camera. It is the least expensive and smallest sensor camera sold by ZWO. Its sensor size is overlaid here on the photo taken with the ASI 533 MC camera. Notice that within the boundaries of the 120mm camera field of view, the star shapes appear to be under control. For this analysis, I changed my target to the star Muphrid, which is in the Bootes constellation. Here's a 30-second exposure taken with the Askar Guidescope and the 120mm camera. Look closely at the central star of Muphrid and notice the very small companion star visible in this image. Also notice that the stars, even out to the corners, look quite round and aberration-free. And now, here's a photo taken with the William Optics Uniguide scope. Again, take a look at the central star and the edge stars in this field of view. Here are the two images side by side for easier comparison. Keep in mind that the image on the right is actually taken at a slightly higher focal length, so the stars should actually appear larger if all other things are equal. But the central star of Muphrid appears smaller in the Askar image, and its tiny companion star is much more readily visible. I took 12 images at 30 seconds each and stacked them in ASI Studio, and then increased the contrast and lowered the brightness equally on each of the stacked images. I also cropped and rotated the images to align them on this slide. My impression from this is that the Askar Guidescope Star images look smaller and brighter. Basically, they look more precisely focused. So, like you, I wondered, could this simply be that the Askar scope was better focused than the William Optics Uniguide scope? It is a legitimate question, especially since both scopes were manually focused. But for now, let's just move on and keep that uncertainty in our mind. I believe by the end of this video, you will see enough data to address that uncertainty in your mind to confidently reach a clear conclusion. You may know that with the ASIAIR, measuring star sizes is actually a standard feature of the software. It is called Detect, and you can find it in the Preview Mode menu screen. In a few previous videos, specifically episodes 21 and 22, I used that feature to evaluate the effect of UV IR cut filters. Here is an example of the Detect feature used on some images taken with the 120mm camera and these guide scopes. These are single frame images. Actually, I took a lot of these images and recorded the star size data manually. However, I now know there is an easier way to accomplish this in ASI Studio. It appears that after you load your light frames into the stacking software, it analyzes each image independently and reports an average star size value. You can see this data by simply scrolling all the way to the right side, where it appears after the Name column. There is no need to use the live on-screen Detect feature to gather this information anymore if you take multiple light frame images. So now let me show you some actual reported star size data. On this first slide, you see the data from the first set of photos taken with the ASI 533 MC camera on the star Vindemiatrix. I captured 12 images of 60 seconds each and previously showed you the final stacked images, if you recall. Here it is again to remind you. But now let's look closely at the star size data for each of these images. The two Guidescopes are shown on the right, and on the left is the data from the Askar FMA135 triplet lens astrograph. Its average star size value is approximately 1/2 of the star size values that were calculated from the Guidescopes. And here you can see that the average star size for the Askar lens is slightly smaller than the data from the William Optics Uniguide scope. This slide shows the star size calculations from using the Guidescopes with the ASI 120mm guide camera on the star Muphrid. The two actual stacked images are shown on the left. And again, you can see that the average star size for the Askar Guidescope is smaller than the William Optics Uniguide scope, quite substantially, in fact. And finally, I did one more test on a third target, the M44 cluster, also known as the Beehive Cluster. In this test, I used the ASI 678 MC planetary camera. This sensor is a little bit bigger than the 120mm, and of course, the Beehive cluster is very bright, so I had to cut the exposure time down to 5 seconds each, and I took 40 subframes. A subset of that data is shown here, and once again, the average star size was calculated and was smaller for the Askar Guidescope. The stacked images are also shown here on the left. So in 3 independent tests on 3 different targets using 3 different cameras, each time the Askar Guidescope gave measurably smaller star sizes. A summary of all the data is shown here. I think this is rather convincing. Even though focusing was potentially an uncontrollable variable, the results of 3 independent tests were all consistently in favor of the Askar Guidescope. I think that is no random coincidence. I have confidence in my manual focus judgment and experience, and this data supports that. I feel fairly confident to claim that there is some optical quality difference between these two scopes. I would argue that the Askar optical quality has a slight edge on the William Optics Uniguide scope. At least that is true of these 2 units that I own. Although that is really nice to know, one remaining question is whether those optical differences result in any guiding performance differences. What you are seeing here is the Askar Guidescope performance on the bottom and the William Optics Uniguide scope performance on the top. These guiding tracks were taken on the same field of view, on the same manually selected guide star, using the same calibration data, done within the same half hour, on the same mount, rig, and polar alignment. I did this several times, and this is just typical data. The guiding performance looks to be no difference. That is not surprising, however. It is accepted knowledge that finely focused pinpoint stars are not required for accurate guiding. In fact, stars that slightly display a broad Poisson distribution of brightness theoretically function better with guiding software than a very narrow and tight Poisson distribution. So, I believe the subtle difference in the optical quality of the Askar versus the William Optics Uniguide scope is insignificant with regard to guiding performance. Both have star sizes and brightness profiles that are well within the working range of the guiding software, and both are sufficient for good performance. Perhaps that final conclusion was a bit of an anticlimax? Well, maybe. But there are some significant design feature differences in aspects of these scopes that might make one scope more preferable than the other. So let me summarize. Firstly, I believe the construction quality of the Askar Guidescope is noticeably better than the William Optics Uniguider. It is heavier, it doesn't rattle, it has a solid feel like a good, high-quality optical system. With regard to the dew shield, the advantage here definitely goes to William Optics. Its deep dew shield provides better protection from stray light and dew formation. This gives the scope a bit more length and an advantage on more humid nights. Focuser. This perhaps is the single most notable difference between these two scopes. The Askar focuser is a designed mechanical mechanism with a smooth hydraulic feel indicating quality construction. It makes focusing easy and stable and more precise. Hands down, there is no comparison. The William Optics Uniguide scope is nothing more than two threaded pipes scraping against one another as you rotate one. It works, but it is cheap and loose. Focus lock. A focus lock is necessary on the William Optics Uniguide scope. This is because of my last statement. The focuser is cheap and loose. A lock is absolutely required to hold it in place to avoid slippage. The Askar Guidescope does not have a focus lock. Thanks to the resistance built into the rotational focuser, there is very little possibility for it to slip out of focus. In my opinion, a focus lock would have been nice, especially for holding it in place when or if one wraps a dew heater around the scope. But by being gentle and exercising a little caution, it is possible to avoid accidentally twisting the focus ring. Field of view alignment screws. The Askar scope has this feature, and the Uniguider does not. For the purpose of guiding, this is usually not of any advantage. But it does enable precision alignment of the Askar scope with the OTA, which can be useful for some other purposes. I find this especially helpful when doing some electronic-assisted astronomy and visual astronomy simultaneously. The use of a guide scope connected to a camera and the ASIAIR aligned with the OTA is an excellent tool to identify specifically any target in the visual field of view. This can help with sky navigation and identification of very dim deep sky objects. Only the Askar scope is capable of offering this option. Image quality. Most of this video was dedicated to analysis of image data, from which I believe I showed a slight edge in image quality goes to the Askar Guidescope. The stars appear to be better focused, smaller, and perhaps the contrast is actually a bit better overall. I think the better image quality is probably a function of both slightly superior optics and a higher quality focuser unit. Together, it simply provides higher resolution and slightly better images. To be honest, the reason I decided to make this video and generate all this data is because I visually noticed the difference just by looking at the images on my tablet. So I was not surprised to see that the star size image data corroborated with my visual suspicions. Lens cover. As is typical of the Askar tradition, and similar to my FMA135 telescope, the Askar Guidescope has a high-quality, machined, screw-on lens cover. It provides excellent protection and just feels classy. Price. Well, not much to talk about here. They are both priced similarly. The Askar costs less than $100, and the William Optics Uniguide scope is around $120 US. Very similar. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, guiding performance. This is really hard to quantify with the ASIAIR. There are many variables, and the process is highly automated. But I think there is no reason to suspect one guide scope functions better or worse than the other. They are both adequate guide scopes for use with low to mid-range focal length OTAs for astrophotography. So overall, I have to say that I am happy with my purchase decision for both of these mini scopes. The Uniguide scope has worked well for me for over the last 2 years, and I will continue to use it for guiding. The Askar scope is slightly different in physical design and fits better on some of my more compact OTA setups. It also is more versatile, and I can use it in EAA applications. Personally, I like the Askar scope a little bit better due to all of these superior features, but that is just my personal preference. Yours may differ. Well, if you are looking for a new guide scope, hopefully this video has given you some useful hardware insights. In my experience with top brand names like Sharpstar Askar or William Optics, you can be sure of getting quality products. Thank you for watching. Here in Yokohama, Japan, I am JP Astro Guy. My name is Paul Cheesegel, and this has been Astrophotography Japan.